Hi, everybody. Welcome today for our Pesca Pick session. I'm Nikki Zawadsky, and I'm here at the Aboriginal Health Offices on the gorgeous unceded and ancestral homelands of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. I'd like to share my screen. Uh, Here we go. Give me one sec. There's a lot of screens. That's the one I want. All right. Here we are. So we are zooming in today, here, all of us on the unceded and ancestral homelands of the Coast Salish peoples, but we're all from different parts of that. These are our Vancouver Coastal Health territories. So we are on the territory here at the office, as I said, on the nations of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. And then these are the other territories, the 14 nations that are also our host territories in the Vancouver Coastal Health region. I'm not going to go through all of them today in the interest of time, but I do want to introduce you to our speaker today, Allan Lindley. And Allan is going to be talking to us today about all sorts of important work that they do with Indigenous folks in their work as the manager of Indigenous services at Rain City Housing. So there's our poster with Allan. Yeah. So now I just want to do a little bit of an introduction with Allan. So Allan's going to share their experience in holding Indigenous pedagogy at the forefront of work within non-Indigenous organizations that work in spaces where Indigenous people are overrepresented. They will explore the intersections of Indigenous identity, ways of knowing and being, and how we need to walk softly on stolen land. Allan is Stamia to spirit from the Syilx, Nusacum, and Mistawasis Cree First Nations in the Nicola Valley in Merritt, BC. Allan is a member of the Upper Nicola Band, Quilshena, which is a part of the Okanagan Nation. Allan is a part of the Indigenized Facilitator community and has worked for Rain City Housing and Support Society in the downtown east side of Vancouver since 2009, where they are currently the manager of Indigenous services. Rain City Housing works at housing and social inclusion, justice, and equity for people who are experiencing or are at risk of being homeless, who are underhoused, living with addictions, and or navigating mental wellness. Allan has worked with homeless LGBTQS plus youth and with communities in reclaiming and remembering Two-Spirit, trans, non-binary, queer, gender variant, identities, history, and culture in both traditional pre-contact and contemporary Indigenous community. They also inquire, ally, and locate themselves in destigmatizing and educating around what often gets called mental illness. This work helps disrupt narratives of indigeneity, identity, and wellness, bringing much needed conversations around inclusion and intersectionality. Allan also works in the Syilx language, enjoys making music, exploring, traveling, being on the land, and storytelling. Theater, singing, and art are just a few of the ways they continue to explore bridging reclamation and resistance in our community. And without further ado, I just want to introduce our ASL interpreters today. Today we're working with Lisa McCarran and Jamie Wilson, and they are both zooming in today from the territories of the Katzie and the Coquitlam First Nation territories in the Port Coquitlam and Pitt Meadows area. All right. Yeah, and I want to hold up my hands in gratitude to the host nations today. I'm really happy that you're all here with us, and I'm going to share Allan's screen now because Allan has some slides for us, which is lovely. So thank you, everybody. I should say a bit about me. I think it's important as non-Indigenous folks to locate ourselves too. So before I do that, I got excited and I forgot. I am calling in from the office, as I said. I'm a white settler, first generation settler here on this land. I grew up on the land of the Anishinaabe people, but I've lived here on the territories of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh now since 1991, so 30 years. My people are Polish and French. I'm queer, I'm cisgender, and I'm a strategic lead here at Aboriginal Health. All right, now I'm going to share Alan's screen before I forgot. Very important. Okay, thanks everybody. Here we go. Okay. Just give me a moment here. There we are. All right, Alan, if you're ready to unmute and take it away, that would be great.
Perfect. Well, good morning, everyone. Limlimt, thank you, Nikki and Pesca Speaks for inviting me to hold this space today. As mentioned, I'm also calling in from the stolen, occupied, unceded, traditional and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. Where I live on the eastern side of Burnaby Mountain has also been used by Katzie and Coquitlam First Nations. And I am an uninvited guest visitor to these territories. And I always start out by saying that I'm an uninvited visitor in my locations because it's not as though anyone from Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh came to me and said, Alan, will you please come down here and do this work? Like most of us who are uninvited visitors, I just showed up and started to do this work. But also part of my story in doing that work has been in building relationship with my aunties from the host nations and my relatives, and coming in ways of walking softly. So as mentioned, my people are the Syilx or the Okanagan people of the interior, and also the Intlakatem, which is the Thompson people. And from the Nicola Valley is part of our traditional territory. My dad's people come from Mistawasis, which is in Saskatchewan, part of the Cree Nation. My grandmother ran away from the residential schools, and her sister jumped on a train and they ended up in the Nicola Valley where their uncle, I believe, was logging. And so that's where they grew up. They didn't speak any English, they just spoke Cree. So my dad was born in the Nicola Valley. And of course, my parents, or my mom's line, my maternal line, has been there since time immemorial. And so I'm really, really grateful that I can come and be in this beautiful land of our relatives and really holding in the work that I'm doing in support of my relatives and the people that I center in this space. And I thought the first thing that I would talk about is, Nikki, we can go to the next slide.
Of course. Hang on a sec.
No worries.
Slides are slow. Yes. Do you want me to go through all of them at once? They look
yeah,
like they're gonna...
that'll work.
There we go.
Yeah. So there's a piece in the work that I do, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that I've been leading in Rain City Housing. I've not created. It's really important that I name that I'm just leading this work. That when we start talking about the importance of territorial acknowledgements, I want to take a little bit longer to unpack some of those pieces. I really appreciate how Nikki came into space of naming Nikki's locations. It's really important when I start conversations like this that I really share that, not everyone has the same experience of settlerism. And of course, when I'm talking about this, I'm speaking of my Black kin, so folks who are stolen people on stolen land. And I'm also talking about my relatives from Mexico and Central America who have roots in indigeneity as well, but whose movement across imaginary borders of the United States and into so-called Canada is often policed. So it's really important when I name our experience of however we're located on this land that we talk about that. It's also really important to name that when people come into these spaces as well, it's for a lot of different, from different locations, so different migration stories of some people who are fleeing colonial violence themselves, some folks who are experiencing and fleeing genocide, and then of course folks that just saw the land as being empty, and they came to settle and invade some of the land. So it's really important when we're looking at naming spaces that we take some time to talk about that. One of the big teachings that I first had gotten when we started doing territorial acknowledgements is looking at where they happen and where they don't. So where I come from in Merritt, they often don't name territories in small towns, because it's one thing to name it in an urban center where there's skyscrapers and where there's tall buildings, and there looks a lot different than when you're in a rural area and there's all of this land that's being held by the Crown. So it's really important that we talk about that we talk about why, where they live and what their uses are, you know, and the reminder that territorial acknowledgements for Indigenous people look a lot different. You know, for me, as I said, it's a reminder for me to walk softly, that my stories and my traditions and my protocols don't actually live down here on Coast Salish territory. They live in the Nicola Valley. And so I'm very careful when I come and I speak of my stories and I share those pieces, that I want to call those back with me so they don't get lost down here. And I want to create that relationship with the ancestors and the land of my relatives down here. You know, it's a big piece. One of the things my grandmother would always talk about when she would ask about like territorial acknowledgements, you know, she would say, you know, like, well, we know whose land like we're on. And I explained to her like why we started to do them, or why they sort of came into the forefront. And she had likened it to coming into somebody's house with good manners. You know, that when you come into somebody's house, you're not just going to kick your feet up on their table. But yet, you know, like we tend to do that when we're on land. So for that, it's just really a way of being aware, and what is our responsibilities and our expectations as guests on these lands. We can go to the next one, Nikki. And, you know, like, I think this is a really important statement here. When we talk about moving beyond territorial acknowledgements, you know, like, what do we do once we're aware that the land we're on belongs to Indigenous people, you know, that Indigenous people are still here? And one of the ways I really like to ground it, especially in the work that I'm doing down here, is really naming that it's all about relationship. It's about relationship and responsibility. You know, as First Nations people, we're called on by our transformers and by our stories as being stewards of the land. And whether you're Indigenous or not, when you're on the land, you have certain responsibilities to all of the things. And in my language, in Tsilhqot'in, the Okanagan language, we call that Temkula, which is the land, and Temich, which is everything that lives on the land. And that includes things that are seen and unseen. And so it's really about being in good relationship with not just Indigenous people, but with non-human beings, the land and the water. So it's a really important piece. We can change slides, Nikki. Yeah, so one of the big things, so who am I? As Nikki said, I am the manager of Indigenous Cultural Services for Rain City Housing and Support Society. I've worked with Rain City rather, since 2009. I got hired, I believe it was during the first or maybe even second year of our cold, wet weather response shelters. And I very quickly moved into the only Indigenous specific position that we had, which was held before then by my dear friend Danielle Hurley, who is now one of our associate directors at Rain City. I got hired during a time when we were experiencing some exponential growth throughout the organization, but yet we were still small enough that you knew everybody's name that worked for Rain City. And I always joke because I was like, I think I actually remembered my employee number where I was on the on the list of like the casuals, and it was like in the mid 200s. Since then, we have grown to about almost 700 employees, stretched across numerous territories with various support housing. And we can move through the next couple of slides, Nikki, and go to the one about Rain City.
Sure. My computer's a little sleepy this morning, but there we go. Do you want this one or the next one?
I think we can go into the next one.
This one?
Yeah, and then we can move from there.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. So, yeah, and I'll talk a little bit more about some of that history of Rain City and the work that we've been doing and the work that I've been very blessed by Kulin Schutten, who is the creator, to support. But one of the big pieces that I really wanted to kind of highlight in this conversation, especially around how do non-Indigenous organizations, institutions, and people come into that right relationship with Indigenous folks. And I think it's really about, one of the first things is really looking at where does your knowledge base come from? And how do you view that knowledge base? You know, are we aware of the amount of emotional labor that comes into sharing from Indigenous histories? You know, are we there for knowledge extraction? You know, are we coming in right relationship? Are we being reciprocal with our relationship with Indigenous knowledge, and how we're creating space for voice of Indigenous people? The concept that I've talked about before of walking softly, you know, that doesn't just apply to myself as a Indigenous visitor to these territories. There's many ways in which we walk softly together. And one of the things that I really like to think about whenever we're doing this work is for all folks that came who don't originate from these spaces. You know, like one of the things I'm always like, you know, Indigenous people aren't the only ones with ancestors. You know, everyone has ancestors. Everybody has grandparents or aunts and uncles or relatives that came from wherever they came for whatever the story was, whatever the narrative, and they brought those teachings, and they brought their beliefs, and they brought their hopes and their dreams into the land. And one of the teachings from my grandmother is that when we do this work together in community, it's really important, and an important piece around naming is we call in those ancestors, because the work that we do in the Okanagan Nation, we have a term that it doesn't have a direct translation, but we call it white chiapt. The space of that is really about, we're grounded at a center point, and behind us in the shape of a triangle is everything that came before, all of the people that came before our ancestors. And we are grounded in this moment, and in front of us coming out this way are all of the people that are coming. And so all the work that we do from this point of us here, it has transformational power for an ancestral healing, for things that have happened in the past. So those things that for a lot of non-Indigenous folks, they get really tied up in that, you know, and we often hear that come out and like, well, my ancestors didn't do that, or, you know, like, are those pieces of denial that come in. And a lot of the spaces, and you'll know that in this talk, I often talk about my grandmother because she is one of our knowledge keepers, and she is the one that taught me a lot of the pieces that I carry in. And that line came from her grandmother and her grandmother before her. And so I bring that in, but she always said that it was really important that we do that work because it's so affecting not just with us, but for generations to come, but also healing some of that past hurt. And that's actually how I really feel is one of the ways in which we center Indigenous ways of knowing and being, which is a really important piece of the work of unpacking these things. You know, and the big piece where I talk about consultations and collaborations, my grandmother was always like, wasn't a fan of the idea of consultations. You know, like she often would talk about consultations are simply a plan that's been created, and then you go to Indigenous people and then you're like, hey, what do you think of this plan? And then you give them about half an hour and then you're like, okay, we consulted. My grandmother saw rates like very fast. She could always see through that, and she'd say, I'm more interested in what we call collaborations, you know. So how do we come together in mutual spaces of creating and centering Indigenous views, beliefs, and community. Okay, we're good, Nikki. Yeah, so for those of you who don't know Rain City Housing, so we started in 1982 as a small nonprofit that was attached. I think we were St. James originally, and then we became the Triage Emergency Response Shelter. And as I mentioned, we've grown exponentially to now operate about 20, and that number's grown since the last little while. We've actually moved into numerous territories around the Lower Mainland. So we're on the Sunshine Coast. We're in Chilliwack. We have 3 projects there. We're in Richmond. We're in Coquitlam. We are in Surrey. We've got a large project that's opening there. You know, and our spaces really include, you know, women's housing, women-led family housing, long-term housing, supported housing. We have one project that's specific around folks who are wanting to lead like more like an abstinent-based journey. And we always work with everyone from a harm reduction model. We have numerous outreach services and queer youth housing with rent subsidies and our emergency shelters. So we can move on, Nikki. Yeah. So a lot of people that we provide service to, again, these numbers have likely grown since I think the last time I really kind of used these slides was about just before COVID. So, and we've got numerous more projects that we're involved in, so we can move on, Nikki. That's just to give you a bit of an idea of sort of the work that we've engaged in. And so I really like this slide to just kind of ground some of the pieces of where we're moving into next. So decolonization is the intelligent, calculated, and active resistance to the forces of colonialism that perpetuate the subjugation and/or exploitation of our minds, bodies, and lands. It is engaged with the ultimate purpose of overturning the colonial structure and realizing Indigenous liberation. That really lands well for me, this idea of decolonial work. And indigenizing our work. So we can move forward, Nikki. Yeah, so one of the pieces, so I've been invited in a couple of areas and spaces to talk about the work that happened within Rain City. And how I always really want to start this conversation is naming that Indigenous work at Rain City did not begin with me, and it did not begin with Danielle. Indigenous work in all of our organizations, whether it's VCH, whether it's PHS, whether it's ATIR, all of the nonprofits that are doing this work for and on behalf of Indigenous people, has always happened. And it's happened ever since Indigenous folks have been there, because Indigenous people show up as Indigenous people. And they show up bringing those gifts and that history of resiliency and strength, and a knowing. And who I often really want to cite in this work are the aunties, and in particular, one of our aunties who is retired now. She's moved on, but was at the Vivian and she's an auntie from out east, and her name is Bernice Whiteman, and she is one of our aunties that really guided this work, and she often doesn't want the recognition of that. But like her and some of our other aunties who are also not with us anymore, they kept showing up. They kept showing up during times when the work they were doing wasn't valued. It wasn't seen as being integral to the work that support workers were doing or that our work is engaged in. A lot of times it was seen as extra work or something that sort of took away from the main body of work that we're trying to do. So almost like the word I'm trying to find is an elective. So something that, isn't considered a part of the main story. But these aunties just kept showing up, and they showed up and they persisted in those spaces of knowing what our people needed, knowing what our people needed in service, what they needed in connection, and what they needed in culture. And for us at Rain City, that's really included cisgendered, trans, two-spirit, indigiqueer relatives. And we've had uncles that have worked with us, but for the majority of it, like Rain City is actually a matriarchy, and specifically when it comes to Indigenous work. And it has been carried by femmes, Indigenous femmes, in that space. So, and a lot of our two-spirit relatives as well. So years ago, though, I think also to balance out that story of these aunties that just kept showing up, it's really important to name that throughout the years, a lot of Indigenous people couldn't stay because of racism, and my relatives who are with me in this virtual space today, what we're talking about, those pieces of invisibilizing and erasure, and not having space held for us. And so a lot of our relatives, it got to be too heavy, and so they just weren't able to stay. And Rain City started to see that, it was very apparent that we were having really high turnovers, especially of Indigenous and Black staff. And so one of the things that they did was they brought their curiosity. And mind you, at this time as well, like a lot of us in Rain City were engaged in these conversations with our leadership at the time, and the folks that were listening with us. And really centering what the needs of service recipients were. And so Rain City did a number of surveys with our Indigenous service users or participants. And what they came to was looking at that what they were doing wasn't working, it was actually harming people. And one of the spaces too, so that they started to look, because as I mentioned, for several years, I was the only Indigenous position in Rain City. And I was attached to a concurrent disorders outreach team. I was the only Indigenous person in that space, other than, like we'd have a couple of casuals that would come. But I remember being hired during a time when there were only about 7 or 8 of us that identified as Indigenous, and we were very, we ended up coming together quite often to support each other. And just create spaces of connection and safety, and naming things. Because I think what happens a lot of times in our work, and especially if there's only one person, we run the risk of tokenizing that person, or they're expected to become the expert on all things Indigenous. And across what our Anishinaabe relatives call Turtle Island, there's over 630 First Nations groups. I am a part of 3 of those groups in my nations, and even though we're close relatives and we have close community connections, a lot of our process and protocols looks different. And so sometimes when we have non-Indigenous organizations are wanting to do this work, they'll move into those spaces of creating Indigenous specialist positions. which are really interesting. And I always kind of laugh at those positions because I'm like, that's actually a really big job. Like, you are the Indigenous specialist. You are the specialist in all things Indigenous, you know, or you become the token Indigenous person in the space. And a lot of times what happens in those spaces when there's just one or two Indigenous folks is a lot of gaslighting can occur. And so what happens is, you know, like, Indigenous folks that are doing that work in support of each other will get together and create spaces of just being able to name, you know, when somebody is like, well, maybe it's me. And we're able to come together and be like, no, this is actually supremacism. You know, what's happening right now is white supremacy. You know, what's happening right now is racism. Like, this is like, and we need to come together in these spaces. And so that work was already happening since I first started. You know, Rain City, my work, and a lot of other non-Indigenous organizations who begin these inquiries we'll start to look at that idea of safe spaces, creating safe spaces. I don't know who's familiar with that idea of safer spaces. That was one of the conversations we'd had, you know, like, we cannot truly create safe spaces while racism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, all of those things are existing. What we can do is create safer spaces for folks. And so how that looked within Rain City is they put some resource towards finding a consultant who came in and did work with the Indigenous staff that were there and collecting narratives about experience. And out of that work, there came the Cultural Safety Working Group, which was a group of about 10 frontline employees with some support from our senior leadership positions and our HR department. And we started looking at the need for these positions to better support them, but also to start pulling away from that idea of tokenistic positions. And we came up with the idea of having Indigenous Cultural Liaison Support Workers, or ICLs for short. And so our Indigenous Cultural Liaisons, they play a number of different roles within the organization. So they first and foremost provide the lens through which all of our work with Indigenous folks passes. They lead Indigenous-led case planning. They build collaborations. And so our service plan coordinators work in collaboration with our ICLs. And our ICLs also play the important role of bridging cultural knowledge into the space. And where it differs from what we did before with the idea of the specialist position is the ICL positions create space for our relatives who might not have grown up in culture, you know, because of the experiences of the residential schools, the 60s scoop, the foster system, you know, and all of the cultural dislocation that can happen for folks. What it does is it creates, they're not expected to be experts in their fields. So what they can do is create relationship with our host nations, you know, and if somebody wants a specific type of cultural work, then we bring those people into the spaces. And how I always liken it to is I'm Okanagan, Thompson, and Cree. And I'm a two-spirit indigiqueer person. So these are my areas of where my gifts come in. And if I have an Indigenous client that wants to come and do spirit bath, or they want to go into the longhouse, I'm not Coast Salish. But what I do have is I have access to this growing number of Indigenous cultural liaisons. So we have about 30 in our organization, and some of them that are from the host nations. So I go to my aunties that are from Squamish-Ulth or Musqueam or Tsleil-Waututh, and I ask them for their connection, and then to bring that connection in. So it's how we create this network of Indigenous folks from all of these different experiences to bring their gifts in and support our clients. So we can move on to the next slide, I think, Nikki. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the important things to keep in mind when we do this work is specifically for non-Indigenous organizations or even individual teams that are wanting to engage in this work, is it's really important that that the learning and the unlearning that you're going to be doing doesn't happen on the shoulders and on the backs of Indigenous and Black folks. That unpacking needs to happen in spaces that you can access that aren't going to create further harm. You know, Indigenous, Black, POC, queer, trans folks, like we come into this work with all of our ancestral strength, but also having to daily face supremacism and systems, specifically for Indigenous folks, systems that don't see us as equal. I remember when we first started doing this work, a lot of some of the backlash, you know, that we faced, and this is also the big call, is having people that can respond to that backlash. The backlash was really around, you know, well, why are we centering Indigenous work? Like, why are we having these Indigenous positions? Like, what about everyone else? You know, and how I've often come to name that is, in Indigenized work, cultural safety exists in a wheel. It exists in a wheel with anti-Black racism training and equity. It exists in a space with allyship and accomplishment. It exists in this space where all of those hold each other up. And the reason why, specifically for us, that we create these spaces for Indigenous work and Indigenous-led work is because we're on unceded, occupied Indigenous land. And we're on land where, because of all of the things that Indigenous people have had enacted upon them, they create higher health inequities for us. So we're overrepresented in the downtown east side, and we're overrepresented in a lot of the health outcomes. So like overrepresented diabetes, the overdose epidemic. And so one of the things that is why we've centered that is because it's important that we visibilize those experiences. And one of the things I've been very fortunate to in my work over the last 11 years in this community is we really go to the people who are working in service of. And like when we created our work and our positions, we went to service users. We went to our warriors in the community. And I use that term very openly, our warriors of the community. And that comes from one of my relatives who's made her journey as well, Cory Kelly, who was a really big support in our department when we started getting going. And she would always walk the alleys of the downtown east side using her light skin privilege. She was an Indigenous auntie from Sitsica. And she would really hold those spaces of being in service to her relatives. And she would often talk about one of the elders she worked with, who they were in like the alley behind like the Balmoral, and they were looking for one of our kin. And our elder said, you know, like all the folks you see here, like those are our warriors. Like these are our strongest people in the nation. Like they've had unspeakable things enacted upon them. They've lived through all of those things, like incredible things, and they're still here. Like those are our warriors. Those are the people that, you know, like we should celebrate, like those spaces and their wisdom. And so I really hold that. And I think that's what's kept me in this work for so long, in centering spaces for Indigenous voice, Indigenous femme voices, is because our people are survivors, and they have so much to teach us, and that work that we do in decolonizing, it extends not just with our community as well. Like we've used that in our work and our connection with our Black managers in Rain City, you know, to address areas of anti-Black racism, you know, and standing in solidarity with other communities of color who are experiencing atrocities because of racism, you know. So I want to name and center our Asian relatives right now who are experiencing incredible amounts of anti-Asian racism. Um, you know, I think when we can hold our communities together and engage in this work, I think we're able to move things forward in really powerful ways. You know, and there's a big piece too, I think in coming to sort of the end of this, like I always really want to, as an Indigiqueer person, as somebody who exists outside of the binary, but I know in spaces that I also have some passing privileges. I really want, and I really encourage folks that are in these spaces watching, it's so important to center Indigifem voices, you know, and really resist those spaces, actively work to engage and pull away the narratives that happen, often with Indigifems and Black femmes and folks doing this work. People who have strong boundaries or have strong medicine can often be labeled as being divisive or defensive or angry. And a lot of the work we've done within Rain City and the work that I and my assistant manager, Ed Siu, do in bringing that is that we haven't really created anything. You know, what we've done is we've just created space around the Indigenous folks who've been doing this work since we started, and just giving them some room. Like we use our positions to create an area, you know, for them to do that work that's so important. And so when in non-Indigenous folks or teams or spaces, whenever they want to ask, they ask me about like, well, how can we engage in this? Really, it's about listening and decentering. It's about resourcing and it's about action plans. It's about really creating spaces for your unlearnings to happen, and to do that in ways that, while at the same time are centering the experiences of Indigenous, Black, and POC voices, are not burdening them with your own unlearnings. So building your own communities of care and support so that you can do that work. I think that might be actually what I have for my conversation today. I really wanted to, I'll leave this up and folks can take a look at it. You know, I really wanted to raise my hand to all of my relatives who are doing this work, and to all of the people who are identifying that the work needs to happen, that your Indigenous clients and program participants, they need, like, culture to them is a lifeline. Culture is an important piece. It's a lifeline that connects them to this identity that's been stolen, that's been attacked, and creating space that allows for Indigenous folks to be at the table making those decisions with Indigenous folks for their care plans is super, super important. I cannot stress that enough. And if you don't have Indigenous voices at your table, you should start looking at that and creating those spaces. And for my Indigenous and my Black and my POC relatives who are there in those spaces, knowing that there's a community that is also doing this work alongside you. And I'm happy to be reached out to in creating that network and really honoring and celebrating your work. And in my language, we have a word that doesn't translate very well. It's ihi, but it just means I'm done. That's my story. So.
Wow, Allan, thank you so much for all of those teachings and stories. we've known each other for a long time now. Probably, I think we met when I was at Rain City back in 2008. And so it's really amazing to see all of the progression of all the work that you've done. I remember working with Danielle as well, and how you've grown from a very small, uh, you know, minority group within a very, growing organization into this huge department, and you've got your Indigenous cultural liaisons. You said 30 of them? Wow, you're on mute, by the way, in case you want to respond to me. um, I
Yes,
know
30. 30
30.
plus. There's more than 30.
Wow. So
Mm.
that's so amazing. And I really liked what you said about the way that you recognized, the organization recognized that you weren't retaining Indigenous, um, mixed race, Black, and POC staff, and you course corrected, right? Like that's a really important trajectory, for Rain City, to see where you've gone and where you want to go, right? What do you see the future of your organization, in terms of this work that you're doing? What do you want to see happening?
Yeah. I think it is within all of my work, like I think, and this is something that I've shared when working with other nonprofits, and even within our own senior leadership team, is not resting on laurels. Like I think, like we need more people who are BIPOC in leadership positions, and no matter what the organization is, like we need representation. And we need voices centered. So one of the things that I'm really hopeful for in these spaces is really bringing more of that expertise to the forefront, and pieces that are intersectional as well. I think that's another really important piece for me, because of my identities as an Indigenous queer person, but also because in my life, like I have a lot of people I love who are trans and who are Black and who have different intersections. My relatives who also sit at those intersections of Afro-Indigeneity, so that they're Black and Indigenous, and really wanting to center some of their voices and experiences, where they experience anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism, and sometimes from within, like the complexities when that happens within your community as well. So those have been areas that I've been really wanting to focus in and just really kind of hold some space around. And also, again, like not acknowledging that I'm not the only person doing this work. I know, I think your last speaker that you guys had, Jeffrey McNeil Seymour, who was my cousin, we were just actually talking about this, and like really kind of going through our list of all of these, like these fabulous Black and Indigenous and POC activists that are showing up and just kind of like doing it out in these spaces. And I really wanted to see more of that being brought into these discourses and into this work.
Yeah, I think we're in a really exciting time right now where it's becoming part of our social conversations that we're having, is ways to hold up those who are, I don't like the word marginalized, those who are most targeted because of those multiple intersections of identity, right? And if we hold up those who are most targeted, we raise up everyone, right? And I've seen that process happen throughout the work, when I was at Rain City, and moving forward with a lot of the work that's happening for folks, particularly in the downtown east side, but folks all over as well, is thinking of ways that, we can make space for folks so they do have their voices heard, and working to amplify those voices. Like as a non-Indigenous person doing this work, alongside folks, I see it as a sort of a lifelong process of learning, of ways to show up, to do that humbly, with humility, and to be always you know, working to amplify folks' voices. What would you say to other non-Indigenous folks? What are some key messages for folks that are doing this work alongside Indigenous, Black, mixed race, and POC folks?
Yeah, I think one of the most important things is resourcing. Resourcing this work is so important. You know, like it's big work that happens. You know, there's the amount of emotional labor that has to happen is incredible. You know, and I think that that's a piece that that I think needs to be talked about, you know, that specifically for Indigenous, Black, and POC folks and trans and queer communities that are coming in and being asked to take on some of these pieces, is that we need to start really looking at how we're resourcing it, you know, like how much funds are being put towards this important work. You know, and that also goes, like, that challenges that idea of tokenizing, you know, like within our work, we often try and have two ICLs at a site, a work site, so that it's built in that they'll have connection, because otherwise if you just have one person on a team of mostly like white folks and with a couple of BIPOC folks mixed in there, like you're still creating systems of disconnection for folks. How do you center that? I think really it's a big piece of creating those networks for non-Indigenous folks, of people who have been engaged in this work, you know, and as I mentioned before, like people who can respond to backlash, who can respond to those calls and answer those calls of accomplice, I guess is the word that I'm looking for. You know, and like folks like yourself, or like Vicki Reynolds, or, you know, and our associate, we've got an associate director, Amelia Ridgway, who's been really pivotal in coming alongside the department, and also just being like, well, where am I best use in this work? Like, how can I create these spaces? And so I think for folks, it's really in being invested in that learning, and being invested in holding in those spaces of learning about whiteness. You know, like it's such a, that can feel like such a big process. And I know, like, my partner is Norwegian, like, is their people comes from Norway, you know, and one of the conversations we're always having, and we've been in this conversation for a long time, is that unpacking of whiteness, and like where I can give some pieces, but also like I'm always like, you need to have spaces in which you can do that unpacking without me, you know. And I say that in our work as well, like it's really important to be doing this work. It's important to be unlearning and learning in those supported environments where BIPOC people don't have to witness that, because for some of us that can be really harmful, you know, when we're in spaces, in community spaces, and we're having to witness this unpacking process going on. So I'm always telling folks, like, when you're doing this work, is to also make sure that, like, well, you're taking care of this piece, that you're taking care of BIPOC folks as well, and that they do, like, the work looks a bit different for them, you know. So that's a really big piece.
Absolutely. Yeah, working to decenter whiteness and to recognize when white supremacy is showing up in every space all the time, and what our role is as white people to undo some of that work. Somebody has a question on that note, asking if you can explain what you mean by decentering.
Yeah, so by decentering, you know, one of the things within the systems, especially with indigenizing, is like when we're looking at the work. So let's take support work, for example. One of the big challenges I think that first came in is the idea that support work only looks a certain way. You know, there's the right way to be a support worker, and, you know, like, you engage in this type of case planning, and this is how your day is broken up, you know, and we have these forms and we fill out things this way, and it's very linear. And so when we started to bring in Indigenous cultural liaisons, it was this group that had worked together for about 2 years, and we still meet, like, it's a still active thing. But, you know, like, we were meeting every 2 weeks and looking at, like, different, I guess you'd call them case studies, you know, or just like, how do we create this work that's not creating more harm. And so one of the practices that would happen is we had one of our ICLs at one of the shelters who would do weekly service planning, but their service planning involved making dream catchers. So from non-Indigenous folks, a lot of the struggles that were coming in for them in not being able to decenter was they would look and they would see this Indigenous person sitting with this another Indigenous person, a client, and they would be doing making a dream catcher. And you would hear something like, well, this isn't fair. Like, why do I have to answer the doors and this person gets to make arts and crafts? Or we're supposed to be doing the case planning. And one of the responses back is like, okay, so if you actually were able to decenter your idea of what the work looks like, and if you were to go stand over there right now as like just an observer, you'd see something really amazing that's happening. The two of them are sitting there and they're working on a project. They're putting their intention into it. They're creating something. They're starting something and they're bringing it to completion. And while they're doing it, instead of having face-to-face, you and me here, me asking questions about your trauma and your life and like what's worked for you and what hasn't, which is, a pretty colonial construct. What's happening is the ICL is engaged in this work. They're joking and they're laughing. And at some point the ICL is asking, so what do you want to do about this thing? Or how do you feel about like a housing option? So it's more of an embodied way. It's not just like a person like sitting opposite from another person extracting this information. It's a really different process, and case planning is happening in that space, and it's happening in a way that's far gentler than some of the systems that we are always used to. And so that's one way that we talk when we say decentering, is that idea that the work looks a certain way. Another one that really comes up is Indigenous work doesn't necessarily happen in an office building. Like some of the biggest work changes and connections I've had is I take people to the land. Like I take people out into the forest. I take them to the river. I take them to a space where it's just quiet and they can reconnect. And for some folks, they can have those challenges of being like, well, I want to do outings too, but it's like, it's that idea of pulling away these ideas of like what we think are the extracurricular, and I use that because that actually was one thing that back in when I first started, that came up quite a bit, was a lot of my work was being just like, well, it's fun that you get to go do this. And I'm like, fun that I get to go and like unpack settler colonialism and like years and years of like conditioned like colonial BS with this person just to create a space of gentleness where they can just put it down and they don't have to explain it to somebody. They see me as another Indigenous person, and on some level they just know that I get it. That's one of the big pieces of decentering, is sometimes you need spaces. Indigenous people need spaces where they can come in, and if they've had a really, really shitty day, they're going to see one of those aunties or uncles or relatives at the desk, and they're going to know that that's the person I'm just going to have to go to and be like, you know what, this was really tough. And I don't have to explain why it was tough, and so that's one of the things I mean by decentering. It's just really about, like the practices that we hold as the work, as the proper way to do the work. And one of our aunties always says too, it's like just really changing the narrative around what Indigenous work looks like, but that's also tied to supremacism, because often it gets really pulled in where folks are like, we're not seeing the work happen in these ways, so therefore we must think the work's not happening. But it's like, okay, well, you're still centering your piece.
Wow. Thank you so much, Allan. Are you getting feedback from me, or am I the only one that's hearing that?
Might be just you. I'll mute myself.
Okay. Thank you. Oh yeah, no feedback now. Zoom, it's such a mystery. We've got only 1 minute left, and I'm seeing lots of thank yous come up in our chat box today. I want to thank you personally, Allan, so much. I really, really appreciate the way that you've shared your work today and all your teachings. It's been such an amazing discussion, and it's got me thinking a lot about ways that I can continue to do to challenge some of those white supremacist ways of thinking and colonial ways of the work that we do, things that are so often so cold and detached, and far removed from community and relationship with folks. And so I really want to thank you again so much, holding up my hands to you. And I want to thank our interpreters today, Lisa and Jamie, and the Indigenous Cultural Safety Team, of course, for hosting us today. And I want to thank our host nations, particularly Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. Yeah, our next Pesca Pick session is going to be on April 20th, and that's going to be with Nicole Cardinal. She's a strategic lead here at our Aboriginal Health Team, and she's going to be talking about the work that she does. She's an amazing mom and a matriarch in training, and I get to work with her all the time, and she's one of my favorite people here at work. And the link for that is in the chat box here, and you can also find it on Eventbrite. Yeah. So yeah, there's so many great folks that are saying thanks. So once again, thank you everybody, and I'm going to end our call today. I appreciate your time, Allan. Much gratitude.